is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the People's Channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different. Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel,
Britain's news channel. Hello, good evening. It's me, Jacob Rees-Mogg, on State of the Nation tonight. Not only will net zero make us cold and poor, but it is forcing us to abandon our moral compass. Amidst the backdrop of the alleged Chinese espionage scandal, the Business Secretary has warned that we need the help of the genocidal regime in order to reach net zero. Why has this secular religion been raised above every other policy objective? The pensions triple lock is set to blow a hole in the budget. As wages rise by 8.5%, state pensions are on track to surpass £11,000 for the first time. As the population ages, the birth rate declines, and a demographic crisis stares us in the face, is the triple lock affordable? Would a Labour government take us back into a winter of discontent made glorious summer by a daughter of Grantham? Well, Labour Deputy Leader Angela Rayner has announced, rather fittingly, to the Trade Union Congress that Labour would abolish Conservative legislation preserving minimum service requirements. After a summer of strikes, Labour unleashing the unions could only make things worse. And to vape or not to vape, that is the question, whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of prohibition. The government is set to ban single-use vapes in an attempt to thwart underage addiction. But should the neo-temperance activists get their way, we'll be joined by a vapor live in the studio. State of the Nation starts now. I'll also be joined by an illustrious panel this evening. Alleged former Tory MP and criminal barrister Jerry Hayes and the author and broadcaster Michael Crick. As always, I want to hear from you. It's the most important part of the programme. Email me, mailmog@gbnews.com. But now, the news you've always been waiting for. We're back with Polly Middlehurst.
Jacob, thank you, and good evening to you. Well, our top story on GB News tonight is that the Poundland owner, Pepco, has agreed to buy up 71 Wilko high street stores. It comes as the retailer prepares to close 24 of the outlets today, with the rest to shut by next month. That means 12,000 jobs are at risk, although Poundland says they do plan to offer roles to some Wilko team members where possible. And that comes as Barclays Bank says it's going to cut over 450 positions. Unite, the union, which represents employees at the bank, has branded the decision unnecessary and unjustified. They say it's going to leave people concerned about their job security and their livelihoods. They've criticised Barclays for cutting jobs at a time when it's making big profits. 2 lorry drivers have been arrested in Romania, accused of being part of a major organised crime conspiracy to smuggle migrants to the UK in the back of lorries. Nicolae Toma is accused of attempting to smuggle 9 migrants out of the UK in 2020. Vasile Balcovel is suspected of having dropped 2 migrants he'd smuggled into the UK at Thurrock service station in Essex in 2021. And that comes as GB News reveals that more than 3,250 migrants crossed the English Channel in the last 10 days. It coincides with the longest run of good weather so far this year. Home Office figures show that 144 Channel migrants crossed yesterday in 3 small boats. Today, 2 boats crossed carrying around 120 people. Now, a residential street in Glasgow was evacuated this afternoon after the discovery of a suspected unexploded ordnance device in a back garden. Police Scotland say they were called shortly after midday after it was dug up. The explosive ordnance disposal team has been dispatched to the property. A cordon, we understand, is in place, and people in the surrounding areas have been evacuated as a precaution. Surrey police say they're working to secure the safe return of Sara Sharif's 5 siblings from Pakistan. The 10-year-old was found dead at her home in Woking in Surrey last month. Her father, her stepmother and her uncle left the UK a day before with all her siblings. Surrey police say they're working with their international partners after a Pakistani court ruled the other children would be temporarily moved to a government childcare facility in Pakistan. Regulators may have breached environmental law by allowing water companies to discharge sewage outside exceptional circumstances, according to the government watchdog. Normally, the practice is only allowed following unusually heavy rain to prevent flooding in residential areas. However, the Office for Environmental Protection says DEFRA, the Environment Agency and Ofwat may all have misinterpreted the law. And a pub company is to charge customers around 20 pence more for every pint of beer during peak times. It's called peak time pricing. Stonegate, which owns the Slug and Lettuce chain of pubs, says prices will increase at 800 of its venues on evenings and weekends. It has previously done so during one-off events like the World Cup, but will now introduce regular surge pricing. With GB News across the UK on your TV, in your car, on your digital radio and now on your smart speaker by saying play GB News. This is Britain's news channel.
Yesterday, as we discussed the alleged Chinese espionage scandal, we thought it only fair to get in touch with the Chinese embassy. It duly responded this morning as follows. The allegation that China spies on the UK is entirely groundless. We urge the UK to stop spreading disinformation and stop political manipulation and malicious slander against China. We asked a representative of the embassy onto the programme, and I'm happy to make this a standing invitation. I hope they'll come on. They might call me a running capitalist dog or something tactful like that, and I look forward to having that discussion. Amidst the backdrop of this alleged scandal, the business secretary was in Oxford today on a tour of a mini car factory, that is to say a car factory that makes minis rather than a small car factory, after announcing a £600 million investment for electric cars. She also announced that we need China in order to reach our net zero targets, specifically with respect to Chinese electrical vehicle batteries. So, as we've discussed before, net zero will now not only make us cold and poor, but it obliges us to abandon our moral compass. To suggest that China is a serious player in the pursuit of net zero is almost as improbable as the statement its embassy provided to this programme. While British emissions, which account for a modest 1% of the global total, have been steadily decreasing over the past 11 years, Chinese emissions, which now account for nearly a third of the global total, are steadily increasing. Even though China locked down its economy harder and for longer than almost anyone else, its emissions still increased over that period. One of the key reasons we've been able to reduce our emissions is because of our transition away from coal to gas. And yet China continues relentlessly to build coal power stations. doesn't want its people to be cold and poor. And in fact, nearly half of all coal power stations in the world are in China, over 1,100. China is not fussed about net zero. As David Starkey said last night, the only language the Chinese speak is the language of power. But the business secretary specifically referred to Chinese electric vehicle batteries. Well, as it happens, the Americans in the past few weeks have been clamping down on electric vehicle batteries from China. Why? Well, because it turns out they use Uyghur slave labour in Xinjiang to produce them, the minority against whom they are committing a genocide. So this is where net zero ultimately is taking us. It has been elevated above all other policy objectives, economic, geopolitical, social or moral. Net zero trumps them all. Are you concerned about alleged espionage taking place in Westminster, the home of our democracy? Well, net zero comes first, I'm afraid. What about the complete disregard for the international treaty that cemented the maxim of one country, two systems between China and Hong Kong? Sorry, net zero takes precedence. How about the repeated acts of aggression against Taiwan? Sorry, net zero. Are you concerned about genocide in Xinjiang? Well, I'm afraid net zero trumps that one too. As always, I want to hear from you. Don't forget to let me know your thoughts. You know the email by now, even better than the teleprompter script writer. It's mailmog@gbnews.com, not UK. I'm delighted to be joined by the former Chancellor, very distinguished colleague of mine in the House of Commons, Kwasi Kwarteng. Kwasi, thank you very much.
Good to see you, Jacob.
Me. You had the legal obligation, as did I briefly,
you did, yes,
for net zero.
That's right.
It now seems to be trumping our moral compass. How do we justify that?
So I think that your perception of net zero is wrong, because it's a huge industrial opportunity. You succeeded me in Bays, in the department that was responsible for it, and you will know that a lot of our levelling up agenda, a lot of our industrial agenda was driven by this thing that's called the energy transition. And very lastly, on my first remarks on this, if we were to say we're not going to do any net zero, the Germans, the Americans with their IRA Act, the Chinese even, I mean, we can talk about China, they're all industrializing in a way that's going away from fossil fuels to renewable energy.
But one of the things I was really struck by in Bays was that we were putting charges on our high energy users, particularly our steel sector, that was essentially forcing it out of business, and then importing steel made in China that didn't suffer from these regulations. This was net zero, making the UK economy poorer.
Look, so I think there are some policy areas where we've done some silly things. And I always used to have, when I was in Bays, debates with the Treasury about this, that we were literally putting charges on our industry and making them uncompetitive, as you say. But that doesn't mean that the overall strategy of net zero is the wrong one. And I saw it in offshore wind. I mean, when we entered the House of Commons in 2010, 40% of electricity was generated by coal burning. Today, that's about 2%. So we've already decarbonised. And the Chinese are doing the same thing. I mean, when I was in Bays, we were the leaders in offshore wind. And today, the Chinese are the leaders because they're building more offshore wind farms.
But you say by moving from 40% coal power generation, we have decarbonised.
We are decarbonising.
We are ahead of the rest of the world. In the Yale study, I think we're second behind Denmark. Why are we going ahead further and faster than everybody else when we're putting costs on our economy and other people aren't putting the costs on their economy?
Because there is a huge prize here. I mean, I'm reminded of the debates about the Industrial Revolution and the Luddites. I'm not suggesting you're a Luddite, of course, but I am saying that there is a huge industrial opportunity. And if we're at the forefront of it, we've got to stay at the forefront of it. There's no point saying, oh, well, we're second, we can hang back and
You're
and
a very
advance.
Distinguished historian. You've written a couple of excellent books.
Thank you.
And so if we talk about the Luddites were opposing the free market, producing solutions that made the economy more efficient. What I'm opposing is government subsidy, government regulation, that dreadful Energy Act we passed last week, which is nothing but cost on consumers.
So what where you are perhaps resembling the Luddites, in my view, is that it was new technology, essentially, that they were opposing. And I think that the net zero, the offshore wind farm, all of that.
I'm all in favour of new technology. I'm not in favour
of revolutionise.
I'm not in favour of subsidies.
Our industrial culture.
That we're doing this through subsidy and regulation, not through allowing competition between
so it's a bit
competing.
Of both. So you have to, and you'll appreciate this, that there is a sort of infant industry argument, where in order to sort of kickstart industry, you do have to support, in many instances, industries. They don't just emerge. I mean, sometimes they do, but sometimes they don't.
But the government's record of picking winners is very
I
poor.
agree. So what, it's a fine line you've got to draw between giving the beginning of an industry some support. That's why we're at the head of offshore wind. That didn't just happen by the force of the invisible hand. But at the same time, you've got to crowd in private investment, and that's what we were doing in the department that you and I ran.
On the issue of China and net zero, is it reasonable to say that we must have a good relationship with China because of net zero when it is behaving as it is?
So I wouldn't have put it like that.
OK, how would you have put it?
My own view on China is that we've got to engage with them, whether that's through trade or diplomacy. We can't simply draw the drawbridge up and say, we're not going to talk to you, we're not going to engage with you because of all the terrible things you're doing. That, to me, seems counterproductive.
But in what way do we do that? Because the relationship we had with the Soviet Union in the 70s and 80s was one where there was some engagement.
There was.
But that we weren't welcoming them to every event that we were holding.
No.
And we treated them very cautiously,
but the Germans,
in technology transfer.
And
how would you handle that?
But it's you know, contrary to common belief, there was quite a lot of economic engagement, particularly on the gas and all of that. That was they were quite well connected. Western Germany with the Soviet economic regime.
But should that be the model? Should we be treating China in the way we did the Soviet Union at that point?
I think that's a fair analogy, but at the same time, China's role in the global economy is vast. And I think we would be shooting ourselves in the foot to say that we're not engaging with you, China, under any circumstances. And from a personal point of view, I remember in 2015, we were essentially rolling the red carpet out to China. And, you know, President Xi went to that pub in Oxfordshire, I can't remember which one it was, with our Prime Minister. And at the time, and we were both backbenchers, I was seen as a China hawk. And now people think I'm a China dove. My views haven't changed. It's just that the kind of the perception of China has gone through 180
But hasn't the behaviour of China changed? Wasn't China pre-Xi Jinping much more in line with international norms, and it's moved away from that?
I think we overdo that. I think they're much more consistent. I mean, they think in much longer terms than we do. And I think they've had a... I mean, you lived in Hong Kong, and I was very surprised to see... I was in Hong Kong about a month ago. I hadn't been there for 18 years. Completely different. Completely different. And they've got a strategy.
But we're going to have another conversation on China. Kwasi, thank you so much for coming in. As always, don't forget to let me know what you think. mailmog@gbnews.com. Coming up, as the population crisis worsens, is it time to scrap the pensions triple lock? Plus, are you a vapor?
What you get for breakfast is something that, if we do our jobs right, you will wake up to news that you didn't know the night before.
It's a conversation. It's not just me and Eamon.
We want to get to know you, and we want you to get to know us.
From 6, it's Breakfast with Eamon and Isabel.
Monday to Thursdays on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
Westminster is going around in ever-decreasing circles, followed by the media. Britain is broken. How on earth did we get into this mess? But more importantly, how do we get out of it? Join me at 7 p.m, Mondays to Thursdays on Farage, here on GB News. We will have open, rational debate. We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this. Join us here on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain is watching.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Patrick Christie's, Monday to Friday, 3 till 6. We tackle the day's news agenda like you've never seen before. It's high tempo, high octane, the most controversial topics and the best guests. You will not be able to take your eyes and ears off it. I'm not afraid to ask the questions that you really want answered. 3 till 6 p.m, Monday to Friday on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
People in Britain, they love free speech, but they also love fair play.
I don't care if I'm speaking somebody from a trade union, from the Labour Party, somebody from the SNP. And I think the viewers like to see that actually we can challenge one another, but in a positive way.
We think we ask the questions that people want to ask, and often we ask the questions that we wanted to ask in Parliament but never got the chance to ask.
So join us every Saturday, 10 a.m. till noon on GB News,
Britain's news channel.
It's all about family, being in people's living rooms, all the interaction and getting to know who our viewers and listeners are.
When I was young, my dad used to say, no, stop arguing. I wanted an outlet that would enable me to give my opinion.
People are going through a really hard time right now, and I know that you don't feel like you're being listened to by the establishment. I came to GB News because it's the people's channel, and I want the audience to have their say on the events of the day.
We're dynamic. We do something different.
Democracy shows that the wisdom of the nation is in its people.
I get to travel to find out what the story is from a personal perspective.
The British people aren't fools. We know when we're not being told the full story.
We've got to work out how Britain moves forward from this.
It's the best country in the world.
The establishment had their chance. Now we're here to represent your views.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
the People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I'm still Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your thoughts. Jill, this country is willing to cripple itself for net zero when other countries have no intention of doing so to protect their economies. And John, we need a referendum on the energy bill. Let the people decide. We didn't vote for this. We can do plenty without killing the people financially. For some people, the prospect of retiring is one of the most pleasant ideas in life, to be able to relax at the end of a long career and spend the days contentedly drinking cider in the garden whilst perusing one of P.G. Woodhouse's mellifluous tomes. Yet such serenity, like most things, must make economic sense. The state pension is set to surpass £11,000 for the first time this spring, putting pressure on the exchequer. The triple lock ensures that pensions increase per annum with the highest of wage growth, CPI inflation or 2.5%. The triple lock is all well and good, but can we, the taxpayers, afford it? The cost of such rises is exorbitant, as it adds to the current £110 billion a year cost and is exacerbated by Britain's demographics. The number of pensioners is also rising, further swelling the annual cost of pensions, resulting in the government's pension bill being forecast to increase to £150 billion before the end of the decade. Concomitantly, the country risks a future population crisis as birth rates fall. Fewer children are being born, and this means fewer workers in the workforce. There are exceptions, of course, though I hope not to be the only one to produce a hexad of children. All the while, fewer adults of working age are in employment owing to long-term sickness. As the ratio of dependents to workers rise, the cost of pensions will only increase. The situation is becoming, to borrow an environmental phrase, unsustainable. Given the tricky circumstances that we find ourselves in, we can no longer afford more than an inflation-linked rise, and we will have to increase the retirement age as life expectancy increases. We cannot afford the current pension structure. I'm really pleased to be joined now by one of the most serious-minded and impressive ministers in the Tory Lib Dem coalition. I say this in spite of the fact he is, in fact, a Lib Dem. Steve Webb was Minister for Pensions. Steve, thank you very much for joining me. You served with great distinction as a Minister for Pensions during the coalition. Do you think the triple lock is still affordable?
I do, not indefinitely, but certainly for some time more. And I think the first conundrum would be, we say that the state pension as currently planned is unaffordable, yet it's simultaneously true that we have one of the lowest state pensions in the developed world. So how come everybody else can afford a bigger state pension and we can't? And I think the honest answer to that is we can, but there are plenty of other things we can do to deal with some of the issues you raised. So if the 2.5 million people on long-term sickness prior to state pension age, we did far more to prevent them being in that situation. They were paying taxes in rather than drawing benefits out, and so on. There are so many things we could do rather than simply say we can't afford the pension and we'll start diluting it by linking it back to inflation.
What do you think the balance is between increasing the pension amount and increasing the pension age? Because obviously if you pay it to fewer pensioners, you've got more money to spread around amongst those who are retired.
And both are happening at the same time. So as you know, controversially, but we levelled male and female pension age at 65. A few years ago, we went to 66. In a few years' time, in the next Parliament, we'll go to 67. There's a debate about when we go to 68. So that's a given that pension ages will have to rise. But we need to make sure more people are working up to, and indeed, in some cases, beyond pension age, which we are failing lamentably on. But actually, the real demographic spending pressure is not the state pension, it's the health service. If you look at the OBR's projections, yes, of course, state pensions will rise, but the health service will rise almost exponentially, especially if we include social care. And there's so much we can do to avoid those spending pressures, preventative measures and so on. And again, rather than cut the pension or reduce the increase in the pension, there are so many other things we could do better rather than target the pension.
OK. Well, thank you very much, Steve. Sorry time is so short, but we now need to go over to my illustrious panel. Former Tory MP and criminal barrister Jerry Hayes, and author and broadcaster Michael Crick. Michael, it's very interesting. Labour has not come out today and said we will stick to the triple lock. There seems to be a realisation that there is a degree of unaffordability of the constant increase.
Well, I think both parties are starting to think that they'll have to abandon the triple lock after the election. And it'll be interesting to see what they promise ahead of the election. I suspect neither of them are going to be promising to keep it in the way they were at the last election. But my own view on this is, look, the key aspect we're talking about here is rising in line with earnings. And the idea of that is that as the country gets more prosperous, which it tends to over time, that pensioners share in that as well. And if you say, OK, well, we're going to get rid of that part of the triple lock, just be a double lock related to a price increases or 2.5%, then pensioners get left behind, particularly those pensioners for whom the state pension is is basically their income.
And they did get left behind between 1979 and the implementation of the triple lock, because there was a long period of inflation-only increases and pensioners' income proportionate to average earnings fell quite sharply. That's now been adjusted.
But it's,
Can't you have
as
a
Steve
pause?
Webb said, we're still way behind the rest of the world. Now, I think it is right that the pension age, I ought to declare an interest here, really. I'm 66 next year and I will start getting my state pension. Jerry presumably gets a state pension. Yeah, but I do think it's right that it should rise with age as we get older as a society. But I think the danger is that, all the measures the government makes are directed towards poor people, and and that rich people in government, be they Labour or Conservative, are actually making the people who are already badly off worse off. And I just think that is the wrong thing to be targeting.
I entirely agree. And if you really want to lose the next general election, you interfere. You take money away from pensioners. Now, you can give all of the arguments, the economic, and I'm with you. There's talk about the Treasury.
But nobody's saying taking money away from pensioners. They're saying still increase it in line with inflation, but not the higher of 3. And you can keep the 2.5% and you can keep the inflation link. Yes. It's the earnings link as well.
But if I promise you £100 a year, and then I say, well, I'm going to give you £60 a year, I'm really taking it away, aren't I? And if the perception, look at the optics of it. Just before a general election, when I think this election is on a knife edge, I don't think it's going to be the landslide that people say. I think there is a reasonable chance that Tories could win it. Whoever wins it is going to be a hung parliament, and then we're going to have to decide who we're going to go into government with. But never mind all of that. At the end of the day, it looks appalling. Now, it's going to be £11 billion a year extra. £11 billion a year extra, and it could go up to £50 billion in, I think, 2050, when I'll be about...
2030, I think.
2030, you're quite right, when I'll be, very old. Well, I won't be all that old, but I'll be fairly old. But I'm a pensioner, You'll be a pensioner soon. I paid my taxes. Why should the poorest in society have to suffer?
Because doesn't any government have to be realistic about how much money there is? And Steve Webb's point about the NHS is also true. We have exponential demand in two areas, really, on the welfare and the health part of government expenditure. We have a shrinking working population because of demographics that are already there. We have a reluctance to have mass migration for reasons that make another discussion. And governments can't give promises that don't all gel together, can they?
Well, I mean, part of those problems can be dealt with by the fact that the pension age is gradually rising. Perhaps it should be rising faster than it has been.
I certainly agree with that.
And second, of course, you know, if you're a well-off pensioner, then your state pension is taxed, and so the cost is less to the exchequer in that case. But I think you've got to. There are lots of pensioners who are living in real poverty, who can't get enough to, you know...
energy prices rising despite the help we've given them.
You know, their food is very basic. There's all sorts of things they cannot do because their income is so low. And if you're proposing that your income should be lower, even lower, relative to the rest of the population in future, then I just think that's going totally the wrong direction.
And
we need more equality, not less.
It's not going to happen. You know that. We all know that. What did Jeremy Hunt say? Be kind.
Well,
that's what the Tory party should be doing.
Mystic Hayes has said that it won't change, so thank you to my panel. Coming up, are we heading for the dark socialist days of the trade union-controlled 1970s? Plus, are we seeing a resurgence of temperance activism?
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening, welcome to your latest GB News weather update from the Met Office. Now, it'll be feeling much more like autumn across the UK to start tomorrow morning, but it'll stay cloudy and milder across the southeast. That's because the milder air is being more confined to the southeast as this front has cleared eastwards across the country throughout today. It's brought quite a lot of heavy rain, and that rain will continue across southeastern areas through this evening. Continued risk of thunderstorms until around 8 or 9 o'clock. But then behind that, we get a lot of cloud across the southeast, some rain and drizzle still over the hills and the coast, but many areas seeing clear and dry weather across the rest of the UK, and it will feel much chillier tonight than recently. A touch of frost is possible tomorrow morning in any sheltered Scottish glens. A good deal of sunshine to start the day across the bulk of the country. However, the cloud will thicken through the day, particularly across the northwest, and also elsewhere we'll get some fair weather cloud bubbling up. But in the northwest, we'll see some rain arriving as well. And the temperatures will be a little bit below average for the time of year here. Elsewhere, much closer to the September average, highs of about 18 or 19 degrees. Now, the rain pushes down from Scotland into northern England on Thursday, leaving many parts of northern England and Wales with a damp and cloudy day. Elsewhere, though, drier with a risk of showers in the north. And in the south and east, it will be milder and drier once again. It stays warm across the southeast into the weekend with cooler, fresher weather, more restricted to the north.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
The Live Desk with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Pip Thompson. It's here Monday to Friday on GB News.
From midday, we'll bring you the news as it breaks, whenever it's happening and wherever it's happening, from across the UK and around the world.
Refreshing, feisty, but with a bit of fun too.
If it matters to you, we'll have it covered on TV, radio and online.
Join the Live Desk on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
So Jubes and Co, we tackle the issues of the day with real robust debate, both sides of the fence, battling it out with me in the middle with my forthright opinions and views. And often really interesting things happen because you start with a position and then by the end of the debate you find actually, well, I might not have thought about that one.
What we need in this country is two new political parties.
You should maybe think about doing a 2024 calendar. I'm Michelle Dewberry and I'm keeping you company right through until 7 o'clock this evening.
GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's watching.
Monday to Thursday, 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. Join me, Dan Wootton, for 2 hours packed full of unfiltered opinions, unique takes, and fiery debates. I guarantee you blockbuster guests and exclusive reporting with no spin, no bias, no censorship.
I think there is a culture of collusion, quite frankly.
And no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight on TV, radio, and online, Monday to Thursday from 9 p.m. till 11 p.m. only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
In a world of dull and predictable radio and TV shows.
Oh, hi. On Mark Dolan Tonight, we've got big guests. We drill into the big stories of the day. The show adds up to a brilliant listening and viewing experience. Mark Dolan Tonight is the most entertaining current affairs show ever, and that's a fact. That's Mark Dolan Tonight, Friday, Saturday and Sunday from 9. Only on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Like all families, we have arguments every now and then, but actually we agree on what the mission of GB News is, and that's the most fundamentally important thing.
GB News provides the kind of platform that lets all voices be heard. We don't hold back. We're free to say what we really think.
Just because some people who live in a tiny little Westminster bubble think that their particular story is important, that's not the most important story for me.
And often they will be difficult stories, stories that you won't find on the establishment media.
Because what people think in the north of England may be very different to what they're thinking in the home counties.
We're going to carry on telling the world what life is really like for households up and down the UK.
We love to be in your car, in your kitchen as you're having your breakfast. Whatever you're doing, you are part of the show. If it matters to you, it matters to us.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I remain Jacob Rees-Mogg, and you've been getting in touch with your views. Carol, as a pensioner on a limited income and have paid tax all my life, I find it appalling that we may not keep the triple lock. It seems to me that Britain wants to look after illegal immigrants in every country in the world via foreign aid rather than its own pensioners. Must confess, I also want to cut foreign aid. John, this government needs to get a grip. To even think of depriving pensioners of a decent increase in their meagre pension is ridiculous. If they scrapped the folly of HS2, I agree with that as well, and got a grip on the small boats crisis, we would be much better off. It was in the late 1970s when the Labour Prime Minister, James Callaghan, led Britain into an era of darkness. Rubbish wasn't being collected, rail workers refused to work, some things never change, and the dead weren't buried in certain parts of the country. It was a period perhaps best embodied by the Sun headline, Crisis, What Crisis? Rail, lorry, jobs chaos, and Jim blames the press. This was, of course, all before the glorious years of Margaret Thatcher, who took on the Union barons and unleashed Britain's economy. Without Tony Blair as leader, the Labour Party hasn't won an election since those days. So the question is, where does that party go from here? Well, the Labour Party deputy leader, Angela Rayner, thinks she has the answer. More power to the unions. Addressing the Trade Union Congress today, Ms Rayner announced Labour's intention to undo Conservative minimum services legislation within the first 100 days of government. Who knew all this time Britain's woes could be solved by empowering the unions? Well, I'm joined now by Paul Embry, trade unionist and author. Paul, always very good to have you on the programme. Thank you for joining once again. Is reversing union reforms of the last few years really the way to grow the economy?
Well, I think it's the principle of the matter here. What Angela Rayner is talking about is the Labour government, as you know, Jacob, repealing the Minimum Service Levels Act. And let's look at what that act does. Essentially, it forces workers who have voted democratically in a ballot to withdraw their labour, and it forces them to cross picket lines potentially. And it tells them, no, despite your vote, we are not going to allow you to exercise your right to vote to withdraw your labour. We are going to compel you to cross a picket line, which is invariably going to be manned by their own colleagues. And we're going to demand that you provide a service anyway. Now, first of all, I have to say, I think that that is unworkable. As a lifelong trade unionist, I know, and I'm sure you know as well, Jacob, what it means in terms of trade unionists crossing picket lines. It's seen as a cardinal sin in the trade union movement. And secondly, it's an attack on democracy. You know, you and I both voted for Brexit. And we got quite angry when certain people suggested that that vote shouldn't be respected and should be overturned. I see nothing
but Paul, isn't this
between that and
proportionate
between what we're asking for here.
That the police aren't allowed to strike, the army isn't allowed to strike. And wasn't it noticeable at Christmas, actually, when the army had to be on standby to take over from people who were striking, and that therefore to provide a minimum service for essential activities is not that unreasonable? We already do it. There's precedent for it.
Well, look, the police doesn't have a trade union. It has a federation. The army isn't unionised, and we know the reasons for that. What we're talking about here is members who are legitimately, workers who are legitimately members of trade unions and take part in a trade union ballot for industrial action in a way that the police and army are not allowed to do. And then despite their vote being told, no, hang on a second, you might have voted to take strike action, but we as the government are going to subvert that vote and we're going to compel you to cross picket lines anyway.
Paul, if you accept it's reasonable for the police and the army not to strike, isn't it also reasonable to extend that to other essential services? It's not a fundamental breach with democracy.
But that's not what's happening, Jacob. As you well know, there isn't here legislation saying that the fire service, the health service, the education sector should not be allowed to strike. That's not the debate. The debate is, yes, they are trade unionists. Yes, they are entitled to withdraw their labour. And if they vote for it, we as the government are going to stop them from doing it anyway. That's the big difference between what's happening now in terms of fire service, health service, education service, and the police and the army. This is a fundamental attack on democracy. That's the key point.
Well, thank you very much for joining me, and hope to see you in the studio again soon. Now back to my panel, former Tory MP and criminal barrister Jerry Hayes and the author and broadcaster Michael Crick. Jerry, how far is it reasonable to go in a democracy to prevent people from striking?
Well, let's just think what Margaret Thatcher did. She's accused of bashing the unions. What she did was democratise the unions, because Michael and I remember the days there'd be people in a car park, usually a Ford car park or a red Robbo, would say, hands up on strike, and that would be it. And she says, no, you've got to have a vote, and there's got to be a 50% threshold. What Angela Rayner has said today, that 50% threshold will go. Now, that is very serious. Does it mean flying pickets will go? Will we go back to the days of so many days lost of productivity? It is not good. Democracy should remain within the trade unions, and the trade unions, who are always supported, should do the most important thing, and that is look after the welfare of their workers and not play politics.
The other thing she did was, of course, get rid of the closed shop. So it freed up individual workers against the trade union that was trying to control them. Is reversing any of that fair? Is it right to go to this next step and reduce the minimum services bill?
You and I believe in free markets, and I think you believe, like I do, in free collective bargaining. Now, the whole balance between employers and employees has gone far too far in favour of the employers. And for the last 15 years, most of the country hasn't had a pay rise at all, where the rich, company directors, people at the top, their pay has continued shooting up. The whole balance is wrong. And the one thing that trade unions have had is this ability to withdraw their labour. Now, if you say, oh, well, we're not going to allow you to withdraw your labour anymore in certain circumstances, then you're upsetting this whole idea of free collective bargaining. And the balance has gone wrong. Now, I don't actually think that a Labour government will do much. Labour's always making promises.
Is she freelancing?
Then watering. I don't think she's freelancing, but I'm sure that they'll be watered down before there's any legislation. They won't be. It'll be pretty small beer. But frankly, anything that redresses the balance between organised labour, between workers and employers, is a good thing. And I say that as a trade unionist myself, a member of the National Union of Journalists.
OK, but dare I say, aren't you extraordinarily out of date? that when you go back to the 1970s, there were small numbers of very big
We are not
employers.
going back to the 1970s. It was a different world
hold
then,
on.
yes.
The balance there between employees and employers was that employers took on thousands, tens of thousands of people. Now, so many more people work in small firms. There is an extremely tight labour market, which is why wages have been rising recently, and that balance has changed out of all recognition. The reason there haven't been wage rises is because productivity hasn't increased. There hasn't been extra money to pay to people.
It's because they haven't had the bargaining power and the threat of strike action has not been, and they're not been, and also large parts of the economy are no longer unionised. The balance between the two sides has gone far too far in your direction.
No, but it's much more straightforward than this economically. That there is a tight labour market, and therefore, if you're not being paid enough by Company A, you go to Company B. You don't need to withdraw your labour by going on strike. You withdraw your labour and go to a new company.
It's the public sector which tends to go on strike.
And where
public
they
sector public sector have actually done better than the private sector, and that's a real problem. The other thing that Angela Rayner said, which I think is a terrible mistake, she says we'll get rid of 0-hour contracts. The fact is, a lot of people, according to the opinion polls, rather like 0-hour as contracts because it's flexible for them. So that would be a mistake. This is really all moving for a sort of vague Tory, a very vague Tory. A true Tory.
I think the 0 hours contracts is one of those things that will probably get forgotten under a... Labour councils use people on 0 hours contracts, and there are all sorts of terrible things that go on under 0 hours contracts. But the trouble is working out how you're going to deal with those problems at the same time as you benefit from the advantages.
But one thing she said that I did agree with, and that is giving people the right to unionise, because they've got the right to unionise, but people like Amazon have been fiddling around on the edges and stopping people joining unions. It's really important that people have the opportunity to join unions.
I don't think it should be compulsory, though, for firms to give union recognition. It is under current law, but that was a change of Blair against the laws we left in 1997.
I think people should have the right to
most people vote for it.
Yes, they should. You've got the 1922 committee.
You don't recognise trade unionists in your company?
I'm no longer involved.
Well, when you were, I can't imagine you did.
It wasn't a particular issue in investment management. The company. Well, thank you very much to my brilliant panel, who I hope to see next week. Coming up, a Viper will be joining me live in the studio.
Monday to Thursday nights on GB News. At 6, it's Dubes & Co. 7 o'clock, Farage. At 8, join Jacob Rees-Mogg. And at 9, Dan Wootton Tonight, followed by Headliners. On TV, radio and online. This is GB News.
Now then, Lee Anderson here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa! Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Join me, Camilla Tominey, on Sunday mornings from 9:30, taking the politicians to task and breaking out of SW1 to see how their decisions are affecting you across the UK. Bursting the Westminster bubble every Sunday morning, only on GB News, the People's Channel. Britain's watching.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it. So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I'm Andrew Doyle. Join me at 7 o'clock every Sunday night for Free Speech Nation, the show where I tackle the week's biggest stories in politics and current affairs with the help of my 2 comedian panellists and a variety of special guests.
Free Speech Nation, Sunday nights from 7 on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel. Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
I joined GB News because I was sick and tired of not hearing my views being represented, not just mine, but so many people that I knew and spoke to.
I just couldn't get my voice out there. I couldn't say anything. I couldn't do anything. Whatever the narrative was, I kind of had to follow it.
GB News is there to provide a voice for those who have been ignored by the establishment media. We think different things, we've got a different style.
GB News is here to be optimistic and positive about the future.
It's real kind of dynamic and flowing, with the audience very much at the heart of it. like a big family.
Here at GB News, we talk about the things that matter to you.
Hearing the voices from right across our towns and cities, especially our towns.
All sides of the argument represented with a heavy dose of opinion.
We're on a mission here to make a difference.
And the GB News family really is here for you, and whatever time of day you can watch or listen.
Britain's watching.
Britain's watching.
We're proud to be GB News,
The People's Channel.
Britain's news channel.
Welcome back. I continue to identify as Jacob Rees-Mogg, and this is State of the Nation. You've been getting in touch with your male Moggs. Camilla says, unions have a role to play in a democracy, but they have abused their remit for decades, and it's getting worse, not only interfering with the lives of ordinary people, but ruining the economy and adding to inflation. Well, I agree, Camilla, it seems to me this is precisely the wrong time to boost union power. And Merlin has a wizard idea. Vaping is air pollution. Khan should charge for vaping per person £12.50 every day. Now, I'm sorry to disappoint you. There are no snakes in the studio. When I said viper, of course I meant to say vapour. It emerged today that the government is set to ban disposable vaping products in a bid to protect children from addictive habits and ward off the scourge of littering. The decision further perpetuates the question, whatever happened to personal choice? Has the job of parents been wholly subsumed into the provision of the state? Will the ban make any real difference at all to children's health? Well, I'm now joined by a famous vapor, Mark Littlewood, who happens to be the Director General of the Institute of Economic Affairs. Mark, first of all, thank you very much for coming in.
Good to be with you, Jacob.
I'm quite impressed that you're a vapor because you were the last smoker standing until fairly recently.
Pretty much, and I think I'm part of the success story of this new science. I smoked more than a packet of cigarettes a day for more than 30 years. I tried to give up a few times, failed. It's only when these new products came to the market that I was ultimately able to get off cigarettes altogether. So that's great for me. Adds enormously to my life expectancy and indeed my day-to-day health. Fantastic news.
OK, tell me about that part of it. What does it do for your life expectancy? What does it do for your daily health?
Well, I think it's right that, I mean, smokers run a very much increased risk of cancer and heart disease. But even if you avoid those, I was sort of waking up with a hacking cough every morning. Unpleasant, not life-threatening. Since I quit cigarettes, that has gone altogether. So I now use vaping devices and another device which is called a heat not burn device. It has tobacco in it, but it doesn't combust. And the real problem, the danger for smokers, isn't the nicotine. That's what hooks you. It's the combustion. That's what kills you.
Yes.
So the nicotine hooks you.
Nicotine's like caffeine, that it's addictive, but in and of itself, it isn't particularly dangerous.
Oh, no, I think not dangerous really at all, possibly even good for you in some ways, actually.
Right, now, I do need to be clear, the IEA gets some support from the tobacco industry?
Historically, we've been supported by not just the tobacco, nicotine industry as well, I think we call it.
Just so that people know, because it's important to get that on the record. Disposable vapes. Do you use disposable vapes, or do you have...
I've got one with me now, Jacob, which I'm itching to puff away on as soon as I leave your studio. So this is a disposable vape. This is what the government is wanting to ban. They cost about, depending where you buy them from, about £5 each, are about the equivalent to a packet of cigarettes. So for me, this would last me about a day. And the argument goes that these are sort of clearly aimed at kids, and therefore they need to be banned, and there's a littering problem.
Well, you're very youthful, so thinking of you as a kid...
I still behave like a kid, yeah.
But is it more attractive to children? Is it at £5 something that you think children will easily be able to afford and use?
Let's look at the statistics here, Jacob, and let's try to make sure that the best isn't the enemy of the good. It is true that you see kids puffing away on these sort of things, you know, outside the school playground, but back when I was a teenager, you would have seen them smoking cigarettes. So the percentage of secondary school pupils who are vaping regularly and have never smoked is 0.09%. So it's probably even true for your 14 or 15-year-old that they have probably dabbled with cigarettes and have now moved to this device, which, you know, I'm not advocating as the most perfect healthy lifestyle decision, but given a choice, you would prefer kids to be on the vapes rather than on the cigarettes.
And in reality, they're going to do something, that children are going to break the rules because they're children, that's what children do.
Sure. And the other argument, which I consider erroneous, it happens to be that this one that I've brought into your studio is a cola flavour.
OK, now isn't that... I mean, I'm astonished you're having a cola flavour.
Why? I like cola.
Because you're a gentleman and you're far too old.
Why am I far too old to like
ridiculous.
cola?
Cola's for children, isn't it?
What, no, banana flavour, is that all right?
Disgusting. I hate
What, only
bananas.
children are allowed to eat bananas, are they? I mean, the interesting thing about the flavours is that the evidence suggests they actually help adult smokers quit.
Really?
Because if you get very used to... I mean, I found this in quitting as well. If you get very used to a tobacco taste, you're sort of hooked on that taste. If you then segue to a different product, which could be bananas, cola, vanilla, bubble gum, God knows what else, you start to get used to that. And after a year or so, this would be my... I now find cigarette smoke quite repulsive, whereas I used to absolutely love it. So I've picked up on the flavours. That's helped me change my habit.
Your cigarette smoke point is a really important one. You and I, certainly I know I was against the ban on indoor smoking. I've always been in favour of liberty, but actually, weren't we wrong? Isn't it much nicer that you go to a restaurant or a bar and when you leave, particularly as a non-smoker, you don't stink of other people's cigarette smoke?
You know what? I think if you reverse the ban now, you would not have every single pub like it was before the smoking ban. What I think is a little unfair is that, what is it, 13, 14% of the adult population smoke in the United Kingdom? There is not one pub in the entirety of the United Kingdom that caters for them. So how about this for an idea? A local council in their area, if there are, say, 100 pubs, could give, for a fee, 2 or 3 pubs a licence to allow smoking. If you're very worried about your jacket smelling of stale smoke, don't go to one of those 2 or 3 pubs, go to one of the other 97. But I'm all in favour of that choice.
But isn't the reason it's come down to 13% partly because they can't smoke in pubs and that therefore this has helped stop something that is actually fundamentally dangerous?
You know what, I think there's precious little evidence for that. It's true there's a correlation between clamping down on smoking and smoking rates falling. But I don't think that's causal. I actually think that it's as more and more information has come to light about the health risks of smoking, more and more people have chosen to avoid it. This isn't thanks to government schemes. This is thanks to individuals realising the facts in front of them.
And do you think we're in the same position with vaping as we were with cigarettes in the 1950s? My father took up smoking because a Labour Chancellor put the price up in the budget and he wasn't going to be told what to do by a Labour Chancellor before it was known to be dangerous.
Yeah.
Are we now in that position with vaping, that we don't know enough, and shouldn't we therefore be cautious, particularly around children? And to go to your flavoured vapes, they do sound really dodgy.
OK, so let's tackle the children thing first. Under 18s should not be able to access these products. But that's not a reason for banning them. We do not ban alcohol, even though some under 18s access it. We do not ban 18 certificate movies, even though some under 18s access it.
Head of the IEA calls for a ban on alcohol.
We don't want to ban these things. Enforce the rules so kids can't get them. Enforce the rules properly so kids can't get them. That's the solution. Don't ban it across the board to deal not only with a non-problem, but I think one which is actually a health solution. This is health risk minimisation with these fantastic new products.
Well, that was a party political broadcast by the Vaping Society, but thank you very much, Mark. It's very good to have at least one freedom-loving person come on the programme. That's all from me. Up next, it's Professor Daniel Wootton. Dan, what's coming up on your programme?
Big lineup tonight. We have Nigel Farage, Tom Bauer, Richard Tice, and also we're debating Top Gear and whether the BBC is going to have to axe it because of its safety record. So one of the former presenters of the show will be here.
Oh, OK, well, that sounds extremely interesting. You'll be talking about the famous English cricketer, Mr Flintoff, who is a great hero to many of us for the 2005 Ashes. That's all from me. It's coming up after the weather. I'll be back tomorrow at 8 o'clock. I'm Jacob Rees-Mogg. This has been State of the Nation. Do you need me to tell you that the weather in Somerset will be absolutely glorious tomorrow, a perfect September day?
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers. Proud sponsors of weather on GB News.
Good evening. Welcome to your latest GB News weather update from the Met Office. Now, it'll be feeling much more like autumn across the UK to start tomorrow morning, but it'll stay cloudy and milder across the southeast. That's because the milder air is being more confined to the southeast as this front has cleared eastwards across the country throughout today. It's brought quite a lot of heavy rain, and that rain will continue across southeastern areas through this evening. Continued risk of thunderstorms until around 8 or 9 o'clock. But then behind that, we get a lot of cloud across the southeast, some rain and drizzle still over the hills and the coast, but many areas seeing clear and dry weather across the rest of the UK. And it will feel much chillier tonight than recently. A touch of frost is possible tomorrow morning in any sheltered Scottish glens. A good deal of sunshine to start the day across the bulk of the country. However, the cloud will thicken through the day, particularly across the northwest, and also elsewhere we'll get some fair weather cloud bubbling up. But in the northwest, we'll see some rain arriving as well. And the temperatures will be a little bit below average for the time of year here. Elsewhere, much closer to the September average, highs of about 18 or 19 degrees. Now, the rain pushes down from Scotland into northern England on Thursday, leaving many parts of northern England and Wales with a damp and cloudy day. Elsewhere, though, drier with a risk of showers in the north. And in the south and east, it will be milder and drier once again. It stays warm across the southeast into the weekend with cooler, fresher weather, more restricted to the north.
That warm feeling inside. From Boxed Boilers, proud sponsors of weather on GB News.